Good Saturday morning, everyone. Today on Perspectives, you may have heard the phrase, a witness to history. Today we're going to hear from someone who was just that. Unfortunately, though, her personal testimony is about one of the darkest days of the American past. It was the last days of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was shot and killed on a motel balcony. This morning, we talk with a woman who was there when the civil rights activist lost his life to an assassin's bullet. The date was April 4th, 1968. The place, the Lorraine Motel, the time 6:01 p.m. Dr. King was in Memphis in support of black sanitation public works employees who were on strike for higher wages and equal treatment. He was gunned down by James Earl Ray. Clara Esther, a college student and a civil rights activist, was participating in the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. She was also at the Lorraine Motel when Dr. King was shot. Dr. King was a Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible leader in the American civil rights movement. Historians say that Dr. King was able to advance the fight for civil rights through his belief in nonviolence and civil disobedience. Through his work as a champion of equality and desegregation, Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Civil rights leaders say that he helped organize 2 of the 3 Selma to Montgomery marches. In his final years, historians say that he expanded his focus to include goals to eradicate poverty and improve educational opportunities. Dr. King was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established as a holiday in 1971 and became a federal holiday in 1986. Mobile celebrates MLK Day with a march, prayer breakfast, and symposiums celebrating Dr. King's life and legacy. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic could not tamp down the zeal of those who wanted to celebrate his life this year. Back in January, the Mystic Society Order of Doves organized a parade on Broad Street with high school bands and marchers wearing protective masks. Organizers say that it was important to remember what Dr. King lived and stood for.
Of course, on this day, tradition, we have a marching parade, but because of the pandemic and COVID, everybody had to downside. But we said that we want to commit to doing something, so they have organized a route that we're going to walk and rally up in the parking lot so they can express themselves and be able to show they love, appreciation, and all their heartfelt desire.
Our guest this morning is Clara Esther, Memphis, Tennessee native and now Mobile resident for more than 50 years. Who witnessed the shooting of Dr. King. Ms. Esther is also the retired National Vice President of United Methodist Women, as well as the retired Executive Director of the Dumas Wesley Center, where she served in different capacities for 36 years. We will take you back to early April of 1968, to a stormy April 3rd, then April 4th, when the world lost one of its most admired leaders. Perspectives continues in just a moment. Our guest today, Clara Esther, and we're taking a look back at the year 1968. Ms. Esther, we thank you so much for being a part of the discussion this morning. 1968, Memphis, Tennessee, and you were there at the church, you were at the motel, and we're talking about where Dr. King spent his last couple of days alive that year. Now, set us up, if you would, how you were involved, because you had also participated in the sanitation workers' strike, which was the reason that Dr. King was also there in Memphis.
Yes, I became very active as a junior in college with the sanitation strike. My pastor, Dr. Reverend James Morris Lawson, was part of the nonviolent process for the South and was very close to Dr. King. So that was part of why Dr. King was in Memphis. Jim had requested for him to return. If you know the history, he was there before when a riot broke out.
Yes.
And he was also there before when he spoke to sanitation workers.
Give us an idea what the mood was on this visit at the events taking place during the strike prior to the speech at the Charles H. Mason Temple the night before his assassination. Give us a move what things were like prior to that night at the church.
Well, we later heard that as he boarded the plane in Atlanta coming to Memphis, that the pilot apologized to other passengers, that they were checking to make certain everything was right with the plane because they had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on board. And so they were late departing Atlanta. When he arrived in Memphis, most of the leaders that arrived at the airport to pick him up shared with him the rumors of death threats on his life. And if you recall the message that night before the assassination, he shared that information. He said, you know, when I arrived here, I was informed about all the threats on my life, and he proceeds to go into, but it doesn't matter anymore because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. And so we were not as aware of the seriousness, I think, of an assassination because he was technically not protected standing on that balcony with nobody other than Ralph Abernathy standing by him in broad daylight with a building and a fire station and other areas where people could have been hiding. So no one actually thought about that kind of in-depth process taking place to take Dr. King's life.
Right. Now, speaking of the church where you were to hear that speech that just brings chills through your body when you hear it and you think about, of course, what happened the next day. Tell us, were you there alone or you were with family, weren't you, that night?
My mother was there, but I didn't know it. So we live within 3.5 blocks, 4 blocks at the max from Mason Temple. And my mother actually walked over and walked back home because I had the car. I had no clue until many years later, as I was telling my story. She indicated that she was at Mason Temple that night. It was a tornado watch.
Right.
And you could hear if you go back, well, I have the album, and if you go back and listen to the album, you can hear the thunder, the crash of the lightning popping. You hear silent moments, and you hear a lot of cheering moments. It was an unusual night as I think back on it, because everyone that spoke eulogized Dr. King. Technically, he had been excused for the night, and so his intentions were not to even show up. And it was a packed church, and Mason Temple could hold several thousand.
Right, that was a big, that's the mother
Yes.
church, I guess you could say, of Kojic, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And baccalaureates were always held there for black high schools. Massive facility. And it was people standing up because there were no seats. And every speaker, unknowingly to me, every speaker that went up was killing time because they had later called the hotel to tell Dr. King, people didn't come to hear Dr. Abernathy tonight, they're here to hear you. And he undoubtedly got dressed and headed to the facility. But before he arrived, I remember Abernathy was the last speaker before Dr. King. And Abernathy walked over his life with Martin King. Several other younger clergy that had been on the journey with him talked about their life with Dr. King, reminiscing all the places they had been, whether it was Montgomery or Selma or Chicago or whatever city, Birmingham, that they had been with him. And they were sort of reminding you of all the journeys that this man had been on for justice. And the amazing thing was when he got there, he starts back talking about his life. And he talked about the threats and made the statement that years ago in New York City, this black woman walked up to him as he was signing autograph books, some of his books, and she asked, "Are you Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And she stabbed him. And the letter opener punctured close to his aorta. And he said, "I got letters from kings and queens and presidents and people, head of corporations from all over the world." He said, "But the letter that stuck with me was from a 5-year-old white girl that wrote and said, 'Dr. King, I read that if you had sneezed, you would have bled to death. And I'm so glad that you didn't sneeze.'" And then he proceeds to talk about, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Montgomery.
Right, that's right.
And if I had sneezed, and he takes us over his life. And he said, lastly, if I had sneezed, I wouldn't be here in Memphis, Tennessee,
That day.
standing up for sanitation strikers.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more with Clara Esther and hear about the following day, what happened, where she was, as well as what she saw. Perspectives continues in just a moment. Welcome back to Perspectives. Our guest today, Clara Esther. We're talking about the last 2 days of Dr. King's life, and we sort of focused in this first segment, Ms. Esther, about the 3rd of April, and April 4th was a day that all of us remember, of course. Give us an idea of how you concluded the April 3rd at the church, and that just surreal type of situation that happened with what was taking place with the speakers, and of course, Dr. King's famous speech that he gave had he had been to the mountaintop. What did you think about his speech?
I really didn't think anything different. He's here. He's going to speak to he spoke to the crowd. He's probably going to lead a march. We're going to win the sanitation strike issue with the city of Memphis. We're going to move forward. And we did. We did move forward with the strike issues, but it took a while.
Yes. So it concluded as something that you were expecting that night. Now, how did you happen to be at the Lorraine Motel on that fateful day, the next day, the 4th of April?
So I have been very active with SCLC staff, and particularly James Owen from Philadelphia, Mississippi. And James, when I got to Clavering Temple, which was my normal trip every day, James indicated that Dr. King had had catfish at the Lorraine Motel, and it was off the edge. And he said, "I'm treating everybody to catfish." And so several of us, I had a car, put people in my car, and we headed over to the hotel. Got there. I parked actually at the stairwell that I ran up, but walking toward the lobby part of the motel, got right in front of the room that Dr. King was in, and he came out of the room, and I froze. And I'm looking up at this great giant for black people. This great man of peace and nonviolence and justice and love, this man of God. and he's chatting down below the people. There was Ben Branch was there, and he said, "Doc, you might want to go in and get your jacket because the temperature may change before you get back tonight." And he turns to go back into the room, and Dr. Abernathy says, "I'll get it." And he then goes into the room. Martin King stands there still talking, and he tells Ben Branch, "Play and sing my favorite song. Play my favorite song tonight." And Ben said, "Will do." And he's just acknowledging people. He's going to dinner at Billy Cowell's house, and then I guess headed to a church, probably Mason Temple again, to deliver a message. I don't know what the night, I can't recall what that night was going to hold.
But you heard some noise happen.
I thought I heard a truck backfiring, but I'm still looking at this man, and I see him being lifted up and thrown back, and he hits the pavement. And I heard people say, get down," and I was still hearing "get down" as I was running up the stairwell. When I got there, it was obvious that the truck backfiring was a bullet. He was laying in a pool of blood, and it was all around his head area. I knelt down, I tried to take a pulse, and couldn't get anything to happen for me. I did see his chest rise and go down, but it was so slow. And so the only thing that made sense was help him breathe. And the only thing I knew to do was to unbutton and unbuckle his belt and unbutton his pants button to hopefully give him a little bit more ability, especially if they were anywhere kind of tight on him. That was the only thing I could think of. I saw a towel hamper where they were cleaning rooms, and I said, "Get some towels." And I remember McClellan being close to me, and I said, "Put the towels on the wound and help stop the bleeding." We could hear ambulance coming. We removed ourselves. I remember at some point Abernathy coming out the room saying, "This is my brother," and he started holding the towel.
My goodness.
And everything else is history.
Tell me, we've got a couple of minutes in this incredible sharing of your life with us. What did you feel when you realized what had happened?
I was numb. I cried. I became a little anxious when police said that we couldn't leave. I called my pastor, Jim Lawson, to let him know what had happened. We were forced to stay at the motel until about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was numb for years and years.
Yes. Well, let me ask you this. When you say that, how were you able to go on with a long, distinguished career that happened for you in the United Methodist Church? How did that happen, considering what you had saw there that day?
Because of what he stood for. He stood for social justice. He stood for righteousness. And the United Methodist women, more so than the United Methodist Church as a whole. The United Methodist Church is stepping up to the plate. I have to give them credit for that. But it is predominantly a white church. And so they didn't see the racism that we were going through. But they've come up to a better position since George Floyd's murder.
Yes.
But the United Methodist women in the 40s stood up, white women with black women from the South stood up and spoke against lynching.
Yes, that made such a dramatic impact. Take about 30 seconds and tell us why Dr. King's life mattered.
His life matters because of what he stood for, and his standing was for all God's children, black, white. If you remember the I Have a Dream speech, he was talking about anyone that suffered needed to have the rights and the privileges to live in our country, this thing we call America, like decent human beings and be treated that way.
Clara, Esther, we thank you so much for coming this morning and sharing and reliving those two unforgettable days, April 3rd and April 4th of 1968. Thank you so much for sharing with our viewers today on Perspectives. For more information on the civil rights movement in Mobile, check out the archives at the Doyle Leal McCall Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of South Alabama. In addition, you can also visit the Mobile Museum of Art, featuring a Gordon Parks photo exhibit of 1950s segregated Mobile, as well as the History Museum of Mobile in downtown Mobile. Well, please join us next Saturday morning at 9 a.m. for Perspectives. Of course, we discuss important issues and seek solutions. I'm Eric Reynolds. Have a great week ahead.
Thanks for watching Fox 10 News. Watch us live wherever you are, on our mobile, our streaming news app, and you can also watch us on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV.